One of the mistakes that researchers do is to write a hypothesis for every research. The truth is, not every study needs a hypothesis. So when should you formulate one? Before we dive into knowing when to formulate a hypothesis for your study, first of all, what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is simply a predictable assumption of the relationship or difference between the variables in your study. Generally speaking, if your study is qualitative in nature, for example, you're doing interview or focus group interview, or you are exploring people's experiences, trying to understand a phenomenon, or it's an ethnographic study, you do not need a hypothesis. You only need a hypothesis if your study is quantitative in nature, if you're going to collect quantitative data. So for your quantitative study, how then do you test hypothesis? Now, there are 4 ways you can test hypothesis depending on the objective you are trying to test. Remember that a research usually has specific objectives. So when you are testing a particular objective that meets the criteria for hypothesis testing, you have to use a test tool that is appropriate for that objective. And there are different test tools or techniques. For example, you want to test the relationship or association between variables, right? You can use what we call correlation to test that relationship. And one of the most common type of correlation is the Pearson correlation. Another way you can test association or relationship between variables is to use what we call regression. We have different types of regression. We have linear regression. We have logistic regression. Okay? So that's for testing association or relationship. There are other times you have a particular objective that requires you to compare 2 groups. Maybe you have group A and you have group B. You want to see the difference between these 2 groups based on whatever intervention or whatever you have put in place to cause a change in the groups. So if you want to test for the difference in such groups, let's say the difference in mean, you can use what we call the t-test. If you have more than 2 groups, maybe you have 3 or more groups, and you still want to test or compare the results you are getting in each group, you can use what we call ANOVA, which stands for analysis of variance. The other way you can, those are all categorical variables. If you want to test the association between these variables, you can then use what we call chi-square. So the aim of hypothesis testing is to determine whether the results you've gathered in your study supports this hypothesis or does not support them. If the result supports your hypothesis, you accept the hypothesis. But if the result is different from your hypothesis, then you reject your hypothesis. Okay? We usually have the null hypothesis, which is the standard hypothesis, and it usually has a negative notation. For example, you say that there is no statistical difference between A and B in a study. If the result supports that hypothesis, you say that the hypothesis is accepted, that there is no difference. Maybe in the mean also, there's no difference in mean between group A and group B. If there's actually a difference in mean, for example, between group A and group B, you reject that hypothesis. Now, here's a practical tip. Before you write a hypothesis, there is an important question you must answer. You will need to ask yourself, am I testing quantitative data in this study, or am I just trying to explore ideas, experiences, or phenomena? If the answer is no, that you're not measuring quantitative data, then you don't need a hypothesis.